Hi, this is AnnMarie Walton, and I'm joined by my colleague, LePrevost. We're happy to share with you some lessons learned from a feasibility study we recently conducted to examine hand wipe sampling as a measure of pesticide residues among farm workers. This work was funded by a pilot grant from the Southeast Center for Agricultural Health and Injury Prevention at the University of Kentucky. We know that pesticides can enter the body through the skin, inhalation, or eating and drinking. For farm workers, the most common route of exposure is through the skin. Exposure to pesticides can cause a variety of acute and long-term adverse health outcomes, from nausea and skin rashes to adverse reproductive outcomes and an increased risk for certain types of cancer. As part of the education mandated by the Worker Protection Standard, farm workers are taught to wash before eating, drinking, using the bathroom, smoking, and chewing gum. More specifically, they're taught to wash their hands and faces with soap and water before eating and drinking to minimize exposure to pesticides. In 2014, we conducted a study to examine how much of the time farm workers reported washing their hands and face before eating and drinking in the field, compared to how often they were actually observed doing those behaviors. As you can see from this slide, farm workers significantly overreported washing compared to what was observed. Washing of the face was never observed before eating or drinking, and washing of the hands was not always done, though 41 farm workers reported washing before drinking all of the time. Likewise, an even greater number of farm workers, 65, reported always washing their hands before eating, when this was only observed for 7 farm workers in our study. Washing of the hands and face in the field definitely needs to be improved. Having supplies provided wasn't always the problem. Because this was an observational study, we were able to see that 2/3 of the time, supplies were provided. When supplies were provided, farm workers used them 2/3 of the time. As you can see, there's responsibility on the part of the growers to provide supplies, as well as responsibility on the part of the farm workers to use them when provided.
Understanding the significance of dermal exposure for farm workers and understanding how few farm workers practice hand washing in our previous work led us to this feasibility study that we would like to share with you today. We had 2 objectives for this study. First, we wanted to know if we could measure pesticides on farm workers' hands using hand wipes. Second, we wanted to see if hand washing was effective. That is, did washing hands decrease the amount of pesticide residues that we measured? This small feasibility study took place in North Carolina during the 2019 growing season. 4 farm workers on a single farm participated. The farm was diverse in its production, from fruits and vegetables to tobacco. The first 2 days of data collection addressed our first research question. Can we measure pesticide residues on farm workers' hands using hand wipe sampling? On each of the 2 days, we collected hand wipes from farm workers at 5 time points over the course of the day. The times that we collected hand wipe samples are indicated here by the red diamonds. So that was just before the workday began and farm workers were preparing to enter the field, our first data collection point. Then we sampled before farm workers were going home for lunch, after they were returning from lunch, but before they went back into the fields, at the very end of the workday before they went home, and then at home after completing their normal showering or changing routines. On 2 additional days, we collected information to help us answer the second research question. That is, does hand washing reduce the amount of pesticide residues measured on farm workers' hands? Just before lunch, we met farm workers in the field to collect the first hand wipes. We then provided them with soap and asked them to use the washing facilities that were available in the farm shop, and we immediately collected the second hand wipe samples.
We're happy to share with you some details on how we collected this data in the field. Using published procedures, which are referenced at the bottom of this slide, We took a dry 10 by 10 centimeter dressing sponge and wet it with 10 milliliters of 100% isopropanol. We then asked the participating farm workers at each of the time points described to completely wipe the entirety of one hand with the sponge and place it in our amber jar, which was pictured a few slides ago. We then took a second sponge, prepared it the same way, and asked them to wipe each of their fingers and the palm of the same hand and place that sponge in the same jar. We alternated hands at each of our time points. These samples were stored in the amber jars in lab refrigerators and taken to the metric lab at North Carolina State University for analysis. In the lab, mass spectrometry was used to give us information on detection of the pesticides of interest, as well as data about untargeted compounds. Pictured on this slide is our data collection station for the field. We collected our data out of the back of a university van. We placed isopropanol rinsed aluminum foil on the base of our work surfaces to ensure that the sponges were only coming in contact with materials that had been prepared in the lab. We quickly learned that isopropanol behaves differently in the heat than it does in the lab, making it harder to draw up and wet the sponges with the 10 milliliters of isopropanol per sponge. Additionally, conditions of the field were windy and dusty, making it challenging to keep our sponges clean and in place during preparation. We were also highly aware of the time of the participants, and since data collection could only occur one participant at a time, we felt we lost too much time preparing these sponges in the field. On the final sample collection day, we piloted the use of pre-moistened sponges stored in conical tubes to address the sampling challenges we encountered, and that mitigated many of the aforementioned challenges.
Early this year, our NC State Lab metric began method development for our hand wipe samples. For method development, they have been using the test samples that we had collected using the pre-moistened sponges. Our very preliminary results do indicate that we were able to detect pesticides from our hand wipe samples. And what you see here is an example output for the fungicide trifloxystrobin. Unfortunately, sample analysis has been interrupted by COVID-19 related closure of the lab. So we do not have any results other than those from the method development stage. We are eagerly awaiting the reopening of our on-campus lab so that we can proceed with untargeted and targeted analysis. We are also interested in comparing our samples collected when sponges were prepared in the field, as we did for this feasibility study, and the sponges that were pre-moistened as we piloted on the final day of data collection. We recently submitted a grant proposal that would allow us to use hand wipe sampling as a way to assess how effective a hand washing educational intervention is at reducing farm workers' pesticide exposure. We hope that we'll be able to share the outcomes of both of these next steps with you in the future. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions about the work that we've presented today, please feel free to follow up with us by email.